What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 196. I'm the host, Kyle Lanzalone. Today I'm talking to Dave DeCamp. He's the news editor at antiwar.com, has tons of great stories up there every day, and him and Jason Ditz are just two of the most important people we have in the anti-war movement. So much coverage of what is happening in the world only gets reported without the war state spin at antiwar.com. So I really recommend people check out what Dave's doing every day. You can share this show at the Libertarian Institute. Also post most of the shows on the blog at antiwar.com, so you can find it there. We share the show on our Facebook and Twitter account, and also post the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. So anywhere you could like, share, subscribe to the show, please do that. It helps us get out there to more listeners. And this interview with Dave is fantastic, and I know everybody's going to want to get it out there and show it to more people. You can also give us money either at Patreon or Subscribestar. We take crypto. The information is in the show notes page, and in the show notes page you can also find the information of our sponsor, Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com, promo code PEACE, PEACE. Tons of great products at Paloma Verde. Anything you could want from CBD. They have soft gels with curcumin. They have sports cream with menthol. They even have products for your dog. I really like the sports cream. It works fantastic. Nice wake up smell in the morning. It makes your muscles not feel stiff or sore at all. And it lasts for a very long time, like 4+ hours. So I really like the sports cream. But if you got some insomnia, some anxiety, there's something that could help you at Paloma Verde. Just use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. That'll save you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Gets the show a kickback. All right, let's get into the interview with Dave DeCamp. Hey Dave, how's it going? Welcome back to the show.
Good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, really excited to have you back on today because there's so much going on. We were just talking about a bunch of stuff before, but we'll talk about a whole bunch of different stuff here on the show, particularly what's going on in Russia, where a few months ago, it seemed like all the tensions, all the focus, what heating up was with China. You know, at the fall of Afghanistan, everybody talked about how, this is like a sign of the rise of China and everything. Not a lot of attention paid to what's happening with Russia. And then suddenly it starts off, I guess, peeking through in the mainstream coverage with the crisis, or at least fabricated crisis of migrants on the border of Belarus and Poland. And that, became a major mainstream news story, even though the number of migrants that are on that border is a few thousand. Really doesn't compare to like what's going on with the U.S. southern border, or the number of deaths there has been like 10 over a couple weeks, and far more people died in the English Channel or attempting to cross from Libya to Italy during that time. But there's a lot of focus there. The U.S. is playing war games in Latvia, and then things really start to heat up in Ukraine. And that seems to, now be the boiling point where Russia is saying that I think there's 125,000 Ukrainian troops near the Donbass. I've read like between 90 and 150,000 Russian troops on the border with Ukraine, whatever that actually means. Maybe, a little bit more details on actually where those troops are, but just go like kind of wide lens here first, Dave. What's all going on? Because there's so many different little places where U.S. and Russian tensions are hot. It's not just Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia. It's also the Black Sea.
Yeah, there is a lot happening right now with Russia, and it's gotten pretty scary. Pretty much for the past month, about the U.S. has been kind of claiming that Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine based on this troop buildup near the border that they claim is happening. And from what I understand, Russia has sent more forces, to their bases in the region. But it's not like all these, Russian tanks and soldiers are lined up on the border with Ukraine. It's just, one of their major military bases is in Crimea. And their military movements, they say, are a response to the increase in U.S. and NATO activity in the region, which has really spiked over the past year. It's really increased since 2014, since the U.S. backed coup and Russia took Crimea and all that happened. But even just in the past, since Biden came into office, there's been pretty much a constant presence of U.S. warships in the Black Sea. It seems like, and NATO and UK and the UK is there. So
Yeah,
Russia says
the
it's
warships in the Black Sea is interesting because it seems like that's almost becoming official policy. Ukrainian, I think it was Zelensky, I think it was the president, not the defense minister, actually requested that NATO have a constant war presence there. And the next day, the U.S. sent a warship there. Same kind of thing with Latvia, where, there's usually U.S. troops there anyways, but now they're making an official request for like a permanent presence of troops. So this seems to be one maybe half step further closer to deploy more troops right onto Russia's border, and certainly something Russia's not going to be very comfortable with.
yeah. There's a lot of moving parts here. Like you said, all these countries, Poland, they don't border Russia, but they're close. Latvia, and Ukraine. It was the prime minister that said he wants a constant presence of NATO warships in the Black Sea. And there was a report a few weeks ago that the Biden administration is considering sending military advisors and more weapons to Ukraine, including Stinger missiles. That would be a huge provocation in the eyes of Moscow.
Did you see
So
they
it's
also were talking about sending some helicopters that they were going to use for Afghanistan, old Soviet helicopters, and they are going to get those to the Ukrainians too?
yeah, they want to like divert aid that was going to go to the Afghan government that collapsed to Ukraine, which is just a scary thought. But you have all this stuff going on. It's kind of this sick cycle. Like Russia reacts to the U.S. NATO activity near their borders. The U.S. claims that they're going to plan an invasion, so it's a reason to send more, and Russia reacts to that, and it's just and you mentioned now Russia is saying that there's about 120,000 Ukrainian troops in the eastern Donbass region where they've been fighting that war since 2014. So now the Russians are accusing Ukraine of a major offensive there. So it's tough to really know what's going on. I don't think Putin wants to invade Ukraine right now. There's not really any reason for him to do it. And the U.S. and NATO just seem really interested in expanding in that area. And they've been warning of, consequences if Russia invades Ukraine. But it was kind of interesting yesterday, Wednesday, in Latvia, there was a NATO the foreign ministers of NATO met, and Blinken was there. And Blinken said, if Russia invades Ukraine, we'll hit them with high impact sanctions, he called it, which in a way he kind of made a concession that if Russia invades Ukraine, the U.S. isn't going to really intervene militarily, at least. So I don't know if that was kind of a nod to Russia to maybe reduce tensions a little. He met with Lavrov today, the Russian foreign minister. I haven't seen too much about the meeting yet. All I saw is more warnings. There's going to be consequences, sanctions if you invade. Russia saying Ukraine, they're trying to restart that war in the Donbass. So again, it's tough to know, but hopefully, with that meeting, things kind of start to wind down, because as bad as things are between the U.S. and Russia, there is more communication between them and, say, China. There's more mechanisms. They've been doing this for a long time. So hopefully things cool down and they don't send any more weapons. But I mean, it's just bad because, Congress is so hawkish on Russia. The NDAA is being held up in the Senate right now, I think, because Republicans want to put sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 into the bill, the pipeline, the new pipeline from Russia to Germany. So yeah, a lot happening.
Yeah, so on the sanctions, I agree with you. When I read what Blinken had said, my initial thought was this seems to be a step down. You're just threatening to sanction Russia if they invade Ukraine. Of course, Russia knows you're going to sanction them if you invade Ukraine. Also, there's the fact that the U.S. has already sanctioned Russia for invading Ukraine and hasn't gotten anything from it. So, it kind of seemed like that was a nothing statement. And like you said, maybe even a little bit of a walk back to not threaten some kind of military intervention. Now, I think it's kind of foolish maybe because unless Ukraine goes ahead and really pushes and tries to, defeat the separatists in the Donbass, I really don't think Putin's interested in like annexing that region. In the past, when they've wanted to and requested the Donbass region of Ukraine to join Russia, Russia denied them, and people pointed out that it would likely be overall like a dependent region. It's older, it's I think maybe like a Rust Belt type region, and so it's not gonna like be a real haven for Putin or anything like that. And also, this is the population of Ukraine, that are Ukrainians, but they are ethnically Russian. And so if, that Russia sees a desire to have influence in Kiev, having a large portion of the Russian Ukrainians join Russia is going to take away from that voter pool and likely make Kiev just a stronger European ally state. And so, I think there are some real downsides to doing it that the U.S., doesn't want to recognize or talk about. And I think the, real way to de-escalate here is to tell the Ukrainians to knock it off and pull the troops off of the border with the Donbass and then work something out, with the Russians behind scenes. But at the same time, I did see a lot of reporting in the mainstream media, particularly from Reuters, Dave, that was actually portraying Blinken's threat to not be directed at if Russia invades Ukraine, but just over the military buildup itself. And so is Antony Blinken really threatening to sanction Russia for troop movements within Russia's own borders?
So yeah, that was yesterday. Again, I haven't read everything that happened today, but I saw those headlines too, and they were kind of misleading because Blinken said specifically that they'll use these high impact sanctions, he called them, if they invade. He made it pretty specific.
Right.
Now, leading up to it, NATO, the Jens Stoltenberg, however you say his name, he's been threatening sanctions too. NATO can't sanction them, but NATO members can. And he was kind of more vague about the threat. So more sanctions could be possible. But what Blinken threatened yesterday was very specific to an invasion.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was the case, but I just wanted to make sure you had seen the same things. My thought was the Reuters staff writer must have thought Blinken had said it wrong, because why would he say, we're going to sanction Russia, and if they invade, it's not any kind of threat at all. It's just, what everybody knows. And so I thought that was interesting. Now, what about sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? Are those in play at all? I think Germany still opposes them even with the new government, right? So are they seriously considering sanctioning them? I know members of Congress want to do it, but I think the Biden administration is against it.
Yeah, so the Biden administration chose not to sanction the company that is running the project and the CEO. They've put some sanctions on Russian ships that are working on it, which are kind of meaningless. Although they could have an impact. It could prevent them from getting work done in like a European port, because it could put the shipyard that services the ship as a target of U.S. sanctions. But I don't think that the Biden administration really is going to try to stop this pipeline anymore. Congress really wants them to. But in the last NDAA, it required sanctions on any entities involved in the project. But so they were already required to sanction the company, and they just didn't, because a lot of these NDAA amendments not really binding. So I think whatever Congress does, it doesn't really matter right now. I don't think that they're gonna really try to stop it. But something could change. A lot depends on the new German government coming in. I think the new prime minister's getting sworn in pretty soon, sometime this month. So we'll see.
So with with TOTS and everything like that, one of the things going on right now is there's a group of Russian diplomats in the U.S. who are set to be expelled January 31st. And I understand Russia has now expelled or is set to expel a bunch of American diplomats in Russia on January 31st. And so I don't know. Do you know if this is something that could potentially be on the table with Blinken and Lavrov today? Because it seems like it would be right in the field of the State Department's talk about that. But also, isn't there really a dwindling number of like embassies and everything for these two nations to expel in each other's countries?
Yeah, so this has been going on for a few years now. The U.S. started taking action against Russia's diplomats at the end of the Obama administration. It really started over the claims of election interference. And then throughout the Trump administration, it kind of slowly happened, and it picked up towards the end of his term. So the U.S. is making these Russian diplomats leave. They say that their visas are expiring. That's the only reason why they have to leave. But Russia says the U.S., it's like they're intentionally not processing their visas. And they view it as an expulsion. But the U.S., they've expelled, kicked them out, told them to leave before. In other instances, it's come along with sanctions in some cases, and Russia always responds. So this has led to a lot of consulates closing, less staff. There's just like a lot less diplomats, Russian and American diplomats in either country now than there has been over years ago. And it could be on the table, but it doesn't seem like the U.S. is kind of interested in really resolving this, because in October, Victoria Nuland, who's the infamous orchestrator of the coup in Ukraine, she's in the State Department now, she went to Russia for talks. I think she met with the deputy foreign minister. And he said that Russia offered kind of a mutual lifting of the diplomatic restrictions, because that's another thing that they've done. They restrict the amount of diplomats that can work at one embassy or consulate, and he said that he offered a mutual lifting of these restrictions to kind of settle this diplomacy dispute, and it didn't seem like the Americans were interested. And then, when he sent Victoria Nuland to Russia to negotiate, it kind of gives you a sense of how serious you are about it.
Right. Yeah, I really couldn't believe the Biden administration did that. That seemed like, something, if Trump really understood foreign policy, that he would do something like that. But, you assume that Trump doesn't understand foreign policy to, like, play something like that long term, But, yeah, like, send anybody else, even her assistant, right? Like, just not Victoria Nuland. Because I think Russia also had to lift, like she was either individually sanctioned by Russia or something. Like they had to permit her into the country, and it took a little bit of, finesse on the, diplomacy on the Biden's part. I also understand that there's like so few operating consulates and diplomat personnel in each other's countries that like it's very hard for a Russian to get a visa to come to the U.S., like to travel or anything right now, just because not because of COVID, but because there's so few diplomatic staff that it's actually easier to go to like a third European country to get the visa.
Yeah, for a while they stopped processing tourist visas for Russians, but I think they started doing it again, but it's still probably pretty difficult to get.
Yeah.
And, I always say that's, if you cut off travel and, it's just like cutting off trade, I think that there should be free travel between countries, and that does good for understanding each other and having a peaceful relationship. So,
yeah. I also want to ask you about this article that you wrote up that Belarus says they're willing to host nuclear weapons. I think 2 or 3 days ago, I had read a statement from NATO head Jens Stoltenberg that said something along the lines of, if Germany didn't want to host nuclear weapons, then we could host them east of Germany. And so it doesn't, saying it that way to like a layperson doesn't sound like a threat towards Russia, but Jens Stoltenberg absolutely has to know mentioning deploying nuclear weapons east of Germany is going to be interpreted as a threat by Russia, right? And that this is the response is Lukashenko offering to host nukes?
Yeah. Stoltenberg said that because the new German government, some of the political parties that form the coalition, their members have said in the past that they're against hosting U.S. nukes. Germany doesn't have nukes of its own, but they have about 20 U.S. warheads, and they have planes to deliver them. And it's part of like NATO's nuclear sharing agreement. And yeah, he said that they would move closer to Russia if Germany uh, stopped hosting them. And so yeah, that Lukashenko said that he would offer Russia to put nukes in Belarus. And I think that where Russia, the Soviet Union used to have nuclear weapons in Belarus, I think there's a base still there, still capable of holding nuclear weapons. So it wouldn't be that out of the question. But hopefully that doesn't happen.
Right, this would be a pretty significant escalation and something that hasn't been the case for a really long time to have, be deploying more nuclear weapons in more countries in Europe. This is real Cold War style escalation. And I don't see really any talk in the establishment press at all about like, hey, we are taking some serious Cold War steps here with Russia. This isn't merely some posturing or anything like that, or trying to deal with Putin, who, they dismiss as some like authoritarian tyrant or everything. This is serious. And, Russia is talking about NATO breaking red lines and asking NATO like, hey, will you respect red lines like not expanding NATO further east and all that. And I almost see like the reaction in NATO to Russians' request is, well, we have to do it. The sentiment and the mindset of the blob right now is so anti-Russian. It's crazy. So talk about Putin's red lines, Dave.
Yeah, he's been saying for a while now that the West doesn't take Russia's red lines, seriously, and it seems like they don't. Judging by the way that the U.S. and its allies are working to give Ukraine more weapons and help them build military bases. And he said recently that if NATO deployed troops and weapons to Ukraine, like their own missiles and stuff, that would be a serious red line for Russia. Um, and of course, NATO, Ukraine joining NATO is a huge red line for the Russians. I don't see that happening, at least anytime soon. They kind of threaten it and hint at it, but ultimately, even Stoltenberg recently said that this was a few days ago. He said that NATO doesn't provide security guarantees for its partners, and Ukraine is a partner, so they don't have a security guarantee. And the U.S. has said they have to work on their corruption if they want to join NATO, which is very funny because if you think of Biden's history in Ukraine, being part of the government that supported the coup, his son getting that job, and then him, it seems like he pressured them into firing that prosecutor. So you could just tell that it's just kind of a smokescreen for let's not have Ukraine join NATO, at least for now, because that would be, I think they definitely recognize that that's a red line that they probably shouldn't cross.
Yeah, I guess is that like that is the main confrontation right now, potentially between Russia and the U.S. would be over Ukraine. I think I read that Putin said, the probability or the chances of war in Ukraine right now is high. So I don't know. Do you see this escalating further, or do you think we could tamp this down and at least go? Because it's not like although like compare this to the situation in April too, where there was something similar happening. Although I feel like this has gone significantly further.
Yeah, I think this has just been going on longer than it did in April. It seems a little more serious. It's really tough to say with a situation like this because it's so hard to know what's actually happening on the ground. But hopefully, after the talks today, they kind of, the tensions get reduced at least somewhat. But we'll see how it shakes out.
All right, Dave. Anything else on like Russia or tensions or whatever is going on in Eastern Europe? It does seem like that. It's I guess to a little bit more. More actors involved this time. The Baltic states seemed really, concerned about what's going on in Ukraine and hyping the rhetoric. Same with, the situation in Belarus. Lukashenko's more involved. I think I read that he threatened to cut gas flow to Europe again if Poland closed the border with Belarus, which I was kind of surprised because I felt like the last time he threatened to do that, Putin kind of told him no, that's not going to happen. So I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, Belarus was a big one. That whole migrant crisis seemed, like you said, it was totally blown up by the media. It's just a few thousand migrants, and they were acting like Poland was like under attack. I think even at like the border, certain border crossings, there was only like a few hundred, like 700 at the most, I think. And they said that Lukashenko flew in these migrants from the Middle East and tried to shove them into the EU in retaliation for sanctions, which I doubt. He might have made their journey to the border a little easier. He said that he wouldn't stop them from trying to go into Poland and the other countries, but it was just totally blown out of proportion. But yeah, Belarus, he's definitely becoming more and more of an ally to Putin because he doesn't really have a choice. He said the other day that Crimea is legally Russian for the first time. So, but yeah, I mean, it seems like those countries in Eastern Europe, they're really eager to have more U.S. and NATO troops and these exercises and the stuff in the Arctic. It seems like it's going to go on for a long time. So.
Yep. Well, let's move and talk about the Middle East real quick, Dave. You had a great one today. Well, I read it this morning. U.S. anti-ISIS task force gets new name and authorities to expand into Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, so this is a special operations task force. It's all special forces from like different branches of the military, and it was formed in 2015, and it focused on fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It was the Operation Inherent Resolve was its name. It's also the name of the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq and Syria. And they changed it to the Special Operations Joint Task Force Levant. It's its new name. And with the new name, it gets new authorities. This report from Business Insider said that they will expand into operations into Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And I think they've already done, military drills in Egypt. And considering ISIS, there's only remnants of it left in Iraq and Syria. It seems like they're not really going to be focusing much on ISIS. There's an Army Special Operations officer that spoke with Business Insider and said, had a lot to say about Iran, saying that Iran is a major threat to the U.S. in the region. And what's interesting is Iran was on the same side as the U.S. in all these major battles against ISIS. And now that ISIS is gone, they need an excuse to stay. And of course, in Iraq, they have the Shia militias to blame for everything. But so it seems like that this task force, it could turn to more covert ops and stuff against Iran in the region, kind of stuff that Israel does that the U.S. might also be very involved in. It's tough to know, like the attacks on Iranian ships and stuff. But this seems like this will kind of be the future of the U.S. presence in the region, a small but, active force. And in Iraq, they're supposed to end the combat mission there by the end of this month, the U.S., but they're going to keep troops there in an advisory role, which isn't really going to change anything because that's kind of what it is already.
Right.
And of course, there's still troops in Syria. And yeah, but it says that they have new authority. And Egypt, Jordan, U.S. allies, so that whatever they do there would probably be at the invitation of the government. Lebanon, maybe uh, that could be the case too, but there could also be some operations against Hezbollah or something that they wouldn't want. So
Right, or even if it's just training missions, I kind of worry that that might stoke some tensions in Lebanon, right? If the U.S. is training up the Lebanese army and Hezbollah is like, we don't like you giving those guys so many weapons and stuff like that. Also in Egypt, I mean, there's really not that much ISIS, but there are dissidents, and it seems far more likely to me that if the U.S. is doing any training with the Egyptian forces, that they're going to be putting down protesters and people who don't like dictator al-Sisi there, and not actually fighting whatever like 4 or 5 ISIS guys they could find out in the Sinai Peninsula or whatever absurd thing that they're trying to claim. And I mean, I guess there could be some militants, particularly with the instability on some of Egypt's borders, with what's going on in different groups. But, to say that this is an anti-ISIS mission doesn't seem to really reflect the reality of who is the recipient of state violence in Egypt.
yeah, that's a good point about Egypt. I know Biden. I think he did he stop giving them like a very small fraction of military aid
I
or
believe
something?
so.
Do you remember that?
I believe
Yeah,
so. I
because
think
they're
it
one
was
of
like
our
100 or 50 million of whatever.
out of a few billion.
Yeah.
They get a lot. But yeah, so yeah, we'll see how this. I mean, it's going to be tough to know exactly what's going on with these special operations for stuff and with Iran and Israel and how the JCPOA talks is a whole other factor in that. So
Yeah. So, one other thing that we were talking about a little bit before the show that was pointed out in a recent article by Ryan Crocker was there's less drone strikes under the Biden administration than Trump. And I would, I've seen a lot of people in the anti-war movement talking about this. And in a way, like, it does seem true that there's less military action going on, particularly than at like the end of the Obama, start of the Trump administration. But how much of this do you think Biden gets credit for?
I mean, the idea of I hate to give Biden credit, but I think he definitely gets some because if you look at, like you said, Trump inherited a very different foreign policy. I mean, the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria was at its peak, but he also escalated that war. He escalated the war in Afghanistan. He escalated the war in Somalia, the war in Yemen against Al Qaeda, on top of the war for Al Qaeda against the Houthis. And Biden came in without that big air war in Iraq and Syria, and he followed through on the Afghanistan withdrawal. It seems like he really reduced drone strikes in Somalia. Before Trump left office, there was a drone strike in Somalia about once a week from AFRICOM, and those are just the ones that we know of that they took credit for. Since Biden's been in this year, I think it's about 4 or 5 official drone strikes in Somalia, which is a huge decline. And again, that's just what we know, but the groups that track this stuff, like Air Wars, they haven't tracked many other drone strikes there because CIA stuff, and we don't really hear about. It is, he's changed. He's ordered this review because Trump loosened restrictions for drone strikes. He gave the military more authority to carry them out, and it seems like Biden kind of, I don't know if he rolled them back or he paused them to review them. And they said that only the White House could authorize the strikes, but I think he delegated that, to somebody lower in the chain of command there. But so, yeah, I mean, it doesn't fit anybody's narrative really. But if you look at what's been happening, I mean, there's been significantly less drone strikes in Biden's first year than in Trump's, not just his first year, but his last year too.
Yeah.
So he definitely gets credit for that. And unfortunately, it's for the wrong reasons. The reason is because they want to focus more on China and Russia. So. Yeah,
Well,
and you could tell that there's a big change also because the New York Times is starting to like really report on the drone wars and stuff. They had that investigation about the drone strike in Kabul, and they had that recent one about a there wasn't a drone strike. I think it was
the
uh,
airstrike in
in
2019 in Syria.
yeah. But you know, and I know that article. I forget the writer's name already, but what was his name
I don't remember.
in the week, right? But he
Oh,
said it
Ryan
was like
Crocker. Yeah.
a failure of the media that nobody knew this. But the real failure is that even during the Trump administration, barely anybody covered the drone wars, even the war against ISIS. I mean, the amount of bombs that the U.S. dropped on Iraq and Syria on these major cities, Mosul, Raqqa, it was it didn't get much attention. I mean, these were major wars and they killed tons of people. And I don't think Trump should have done it. There's kind of this assumption that because it was ISIS, we had to do something. Nobody really gives Trump a hard time for that war, but I don't, he could have not done that. But so, yeah, so it is a different situation that Biden inherited, but he's definitely been less hawkish than Trump in this area. And it's never what you expect. Biden ran on staying in Afghanistan, and he is the one that pulled out. Trump ran on leaving, and he stayed the whole time. He did set up the deal that got us out, so he gets credit for that, but it's just not what you expect. And
Yeah.
I don't have faith that Trump would have followed through with the withdrawal with all the media pressure because he turned around this. He couldn't handle pulling out of Syria with everybody was screaming about the Kurds, something that everybody would have forgotten about in a week. And he ultimately, reversed his decision. So, and during the withdrawal, he was releasing statements like, "Oh, I would be bombing the hell out of the Taliban and all of our weapons there right now." So
Yeah. So, I would guess the two places you really give him credit for would be Afghanistan and Somalia, where in Afghanistan, even if you look at it and say it's circumstantial with, Trump stealing everything like that, and that he really didn't have other options anyways, which I think is mostly the case. We could have invaded, but it seemed like he was kind of put in a place where he made the decisions that were the only ones available to him. However, Trump was dropping thousands of bombs on Afghanistan a year, and even in the lead up to the withdrawal during Biden's administration, the media presented it as Trump had barely been waging a war over the past couple of years and allowed the resurgence of the Taliban, and that just wasn't true at all. Airstrikes were way up in Afghanistan during the Trump administration, so at least Biden didn't carpet bomb the place on the way out the door. He
yeah,
could get credit for that because I think Trump would have. Then in Somalia, definitely gets credit because Trump had ramped up that war to an unbelievable level, and really for no reason. He wanted to get out of the thing when he came into office, and they wouldn't let him leave, and so they bombed it double. When it comes to Iraq and Syria, I mean, there's really not much Biden could do now. Iraq, it's the Iraqi military that's going to carry out any strikes against ISIS. It's not going to be the U.S. really. And then in Syria, the territory is either controlled by the U.S. or the Syrian government. And so what's the U.S. going to do? Bomb our Kurdish allies for conscripting 15-year-old girls? I mean, maybe, but I don't think that's going to be Biden's step. Also, when you mentioned pulling troops out of Iraq, before it had been the case that to pull out of Iraq, the U.S. will also have to pull out of Syria because there's so much supplies that go from Iraq to Syria to reinforce the U.S. troops there. That do you think like they have the capability to really pull out of Iraq and stay in Syria, or are we at the point now where if we're pulling out of Iraq, that also means we're getting out of Syria?
yeah, I think they need to be in Iraq to be in Syria, from how I understand it, because that's how all the supplies get to those bases. Not all of them. I'm sure a lot is flown in too, but I think it's a big part of supporting the presence in Syria. And they don't want to leave Syria. I really don't think that. I think they want to stay there. They want this status quo to be the status quo for a long time. The occupation of eastern Syria, the sanctions, and the constant Israeli airstrikes. And it's similar to how Iraq was, in the 1990s after the Gulf War, except the U.S. occupies a good chunk of the country. So that's a pretty bad situation. So that's, you know, I don't want to make light of the stuff that Biden is doing in the Middle East, in Syria, especially in Yemen. I mean, the war in Yemen is like, it's just,
Saudi has
it's,
really turned up the bombing there. They're
yeah,
dropping like 20 plus strikes a week. Jason Ditz is keeping up with it at antiwar.com. But yeah, 20 plus strikes a week. And I think even the Houthis admit that they've lost like 15,000 fighters since
15,000
June.
since June.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. It's so turned up and nobody notices it. Man, I got to remember writers' names so I can give them credit. But there was just something I read today. Daniel Larison quoted it in his column this week. I have to look at the guy's name. I want to say Adam Johnson, but he wrote an article on his
Yeah, for
Substack.
MSNBC, or
And
criticizing MSNBC for not covering the Yemen war since Biden took over.
yeah, it's been a year since they've had a segment on the war. They covered when he said that he was ending support for offensive operations there, and that's it. And he hasn't. He hasn't done that. The war's still going. People are still starving to death. The UN is saying now 377,000 people will have died in the war by the end of this year, and that's probably a low estimate. So it's just really horrible.
Yeah. Dave, one more really horrible thing that you've been writing about before we wrap up here. This one, goes back a little bit, but it's a really important issue that just doesn't get any coverage at all. And that is during the 40s and the 50s, the U.S. just dropped a bunch of nuclear weapons out in the Pacific Ocean on islands. And, when you look at a globe or something and you look at the size of the United States and you see these little dots of land out there, you really don't think about them much. But some people live on some of those little dots of land, and when you drop nuclear weapons on the island a couple miles away from theirs or wherever it was, it creates some pretty significant problems for you and your people. So what's going on with the Marshall Islands?
Yeah, so there was a story in the Associated Press about this, um, that the U.S., the Biden administration, is refusing to engage with the Marshall Islands about compensation for the damages caused by the dozens of nuclear weapons tests and to clean up the radiation that's still there. Um, and but it was interesting because the AP they titled the article that Congress is worried that this issue is gonna that because there's this disagreement with the Marshall Islands, China could move in to the area. So that's what they're concerned about. But the Marshall Islands, it's essentially U.S. territory. They have an agreement with the Marshall Islands and other Pacific island nations. And there's a major U.S. military base there, but that agreement is due to expire soon. And there is a major issue over the nuclear stuff because the U.S. in the 1980s, they paid out like $150 million to the islands for the test, but that's nothing to clean up all the radiation and stuff. They estimate that it's about 2 or 3 billion, I think, that they want. So, I mean, and this stuff is really, really horrible. A good documentary about it is The Coming War with China, it's called, by John Pilger. And the first part of it kind of goes over the U.S. kind of legacy in this area. And on the Bikini Atoll, especially, they carried out this huge test, and then they let the native islanders like go back, and when they knew that they would be exposed to radiation, and that's just one part of it. These people that they quoted in the AP story, one guy, his mom was pregnant when one of the tests happened and gave birth to a stillborn baby, and this stuff is still happening today, and it's really horrible. And yeah, the U.S. just doesn't have any interest. They said, "Oh, we paid the settlement. That's it. We don't have anything else to discuss."
Yeah, I forget. I want to say it might have been Anne Wright who was doing some activism and writing on this and was talking about how, like, after one of the tests, like the fallout actually fell on the Bikini Atoll, and so like people didn't know what it was because they weren't like told like, hey, at least stay inside your house or something like that, and so like people were out playing it and just getting it on them and all that kind of stuff, and I'm sure the $150 million doesn't even get close to like covering the cancer caused by this, much less like the needed like clean up a treatment or from all the tests and everything. And the fact that the U.S. government that spends what's the military budget looking 800 billion or something, the NDAA might be packed full of
It's
already,
great. It's crazy.
and that they're trying to give away the billions of dollars in funds to that was for the Afghan government to literally anyone but the Afghans. Why not at least give it to these people, right? Like help somebody that was hurt, But they're gonna give it away to. I think they're gonna like settle up on some lawsuits that judges have issued against the Taliban or something like this, and maybe gonna give some of the money to Ukraine and all kinds of crazy things when if the government is going to do something with billions of dollars other than give it to the Afghans, at least give it to some kind of victims of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah,
So
yeah. People should check out that documentary because it's just something a lot of Americans don't know about. And then that also goes over, Okinawa. Like people in Okinawa are very opposed to the U.S. military presence on that island, and I forget the percentage of how much of the island is covered by U.S. military bases and the pollution and the air pollution. I mean, they have fighter jets flying in and out of this like uh, these little villages on this beautiful island, and the U.S. is just like destroying the habitats and stuff. Um, and in South Korea too, there's a lot of opposition to the U.S. presence there, and it's something people don't think about too much.
yeah, a lot of the bases I know I've read about them in South Korea specifically. The foam they use to put out fires on runways and stuff like that, and they probably just use it for training and stuff like that too, is highly, highly like toxic and cancerous. And like I think they just kind of let it sit in the like soil or like seep into the groundwater, and it's a problem, probably forever. It's
Yeah.
not gonna be fits. But Dave, thanks so much for coming back on the show again. We'll have to do it again soon. Everybody read Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com pretty much every day of the week. You and Jason Ditz have five, six, seven, sometimes more stories every day for us to read on what's actually happening with foreign policy. And then you are at DeCamp Dave on Twitter.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me back.
Yep, great to have you on, Dave.